There was a woman standing in my living room holding a copy of my ultrasound. No one had invited her. She did not look at me first. She looked at my husband like she already belonged there, like I was the one who had walked into the wrong life. "I just wanted to meet my baby early," she said quietly. No one corrected her. Not him, not his mother, not even the silence. I remember how carefully I placed my bag down, as if any sudden movement would confirm something I was not ready to understand. I remember how everyone avoided my eyes. That was the first moment I realized something had been decided about my child without me. I used to measure my days in quiet routines, not because I needed structure, but because it made things easier for everyone else. If I woke up at the same time, made breakfast the same way, kept the house predictable, there were fewer questions, fewer interruptions, fewer moments where I had to explain myself. Pregnancy only made that instinct stronger. I moved slower, spoke less, observed more. Mornings began with the same careful rhythm. I would wake before him, sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the dizziness pass before standing. The room always felt slightly unfamiliar in those first seconds, like I had entered someone else's life overnight and was still adjusting to the role. By the time he woke up, everything was already in place, tea steeping, curtains drawn just enough to soften the light, the air quiet, controlled. He liked things that way. "You shouldn't overexert yourself," he would say, even on mornings when I had barely done anything. His tone was always calm, measured, concern without urgency. I nodded every time. It felt easier than explaining that I was not tired from effort. I was tired from thinking. His mother visited often. Not announced, not scheduled. She would arrive with small bags, fruit, folded clothes, things she said I would need later. She moved through the house with the same familiarity as her son, opening cabinets without asking, adjusting things slightly out of place. I learned quickly not to follow her, not because she was unkind, because she never explained what she was doing. "Rest," she would tell me without looking directly at me. "You need to be careful now." I would return to the sofa or the chair near the window, hands resting lightly over my stomach. From there, I could hear them speaking in the kitchen. Their voices stayed low, steady. Not secretive enough to raise alarm, just quiet enough that words blurred into tone. Sometimes my name would surface, not clearly, just enough to notice. I told myself it was normal. Families discuss things. Decisions get made in conversation. I had never been someone who needed to be involved in every detail. It felt unnecessary, disruptive. That was what I believed then. That inclusion was optional. That silence was a form of trust. In the early months, he came with me to every appointment. He sat beside me, attentive, asking questions I had not thought to ask. The doctors spoke more to him than to me sometimes, explaining procedures, timelines, expectations. I watched the way he nodded, how he absorbed information, how easily he translated it into plans. "It's better if I handle these things," he said once as we walked back to the car. "You should focus on staying calm." I agreed, not because I felt incapable, but because he seemed certain. And certainty has a way of quieting doubt before it fully forms. At home, documents began to gather in small, organized stacks, medical papers, appointment summaries, notes written in his handwriting, dates, numbers, short reminders. I did not go through them unless he asked me to sign something. He always explained briefly, "This is just for hospital records. This is standard. It's easier if everything is consistent." The word consistent came up often. I started to associate it with safety. Consistency meant no surprises, no conflict, no raised voices. I had never been comfortable with confrontation. Even as a child, I learned to listen more than I spoke, to observe patterns instead of interrupting them. So I adapted. If conversations shifted when I entered the room, I pretended not to notice. If decisions were referenced that I did not remember making, I assumed I had forgotten. Pregnancy, they said, affected memory. It was a reasonable explanation, and I preferred reasonable explanations. In the evenings, we sat together in the living room. The television would be on, but neither of us paid much attention to it. He would scroll through his phone or review papers. I would sit beside him, one hand resting over my stomach, feeling the subtle changes inside me that no one else could feel. That part was mine, untouched by conversation, unaffected by tone. Sometimes he would place his hand there too, briefly. "Everything is progressing well," he would say, more like a statement than a question. I would nod, because as far as I knew it was. There were no arguments, no visible fractures, no moment where I could point to something and say, "This is wrong." Only small absences. Small gaps in understanding that I filled with trust. I believed that if something truly mattered, I would be told. I believed that silence meant stability. I believed that the life forming inside me was something we were preparing for together. And because nothing openly contradicted that belief, I never questioned it. Not out loud. Not yet. The changes did not arrive all at once. They settled in quietly the way dust does, thin, almost invisible, only noticeable when the light shifts in a certain direction. At first, it was his phone. He had never been secretive before, not deliberately open, but not guarded either. It would rest on the table, on the sofa between us, sometimes even in my reach when he stepped away. Then, gradually, it stopped being still. He began keeping it closer, face down, screen dark. If it rang, he would glance at it first, always that brief pause before deciding whether to answer. When he did, his voice lowered, not enough to seem suspicious, just enough to remove clarity. "Work," he would say afterward without me asking. I accepted that. Work had always been something I did not interfere with. It existed outside of me, structured and necessary. I had no reason to question it, but there were small inconsistencies. He started stepping out to take certain calls, even when we were alone. Not every time, only occasionally, just enough that it did not form a pattern I could easily point to. The first time I noticed, I was sitting at the dining table, sorting through a small stack of medical papers he had left there. He was in the next room, speaking. The door was not fully closed. I could not hear the words clearly, only fragments. "Not yet. Timing. She doesn't need to." The sentence did not finish. Maybe it did, and I just did not hear it. When he came back, his expression had already returned to normal. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded before I realized I had not answered the question he actually meant. "Yes," I said a moment later. He studied me briefly, then sat down across from me, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "You don't need to go through all of these," he said calmly. "It can get confusing." "I was just looking," I replied. "There's nothing new," he said. "I'll tell you if there is." The conversation ended there, not abruptly, just closed. His mother's visits became more frequent after that. She began asking questions that felt specific in a way I could not explain. "Has the doctor mentioned long-term arrangements?" she asked one afternoon as she adjusted the cushions behind my back. I looked at her, unsure what she meant. "Arrangements? For after," she clarified, her tone neutral. "Support systems, planning ahead is important, I think." "We'll figure it out," I said. She gave a small nod as if acknowledging an answer that was incomplete. "Yes," she said. "Of course, it's just that some things are better decided early." Later that evening, I mentioned it to him. "Your mother was asking about arrangements," I said carefully. He did not look up immediately. "She worries," he replied after a moment. "It's normal." I wasn't sure what she meant. "It's nothing you need to stress about," he said. "We're handling everything." "We." The word settled somewhere uneasy. Not wrong, just slightly misplaced. I tried to let it go, but similar moments continued. A conversation would stop when I entered a room, then resume later in a different tone. A document would be moved before I had the chance to read it fully. Once, I found a folder in the study that I did not recognize. It was labeled simply, without detail. Inside were papers, official, structured, unfamiliar in their formatting. Before I could look closely, he appeared behind me. "That's not something you need to worry about," he said, taking it gently from my hands. "I was just curious," I replied. "I know," he said, "but it's better if we keep things simple for you." Simple. The word was always presented as kindness. As protection, I nodded again, because disagreeing would have required a certainty I did not have. At night, when the house was quiet, I began noticing how often I replayed small interactions in my mind. Not searching for answers, just trying to understand tone. Why a sentence had been phrased a certain way. Why a question had felt heavier than it should. None of it was enough to confront, nothing clear, nothing direct. Only a growing awareness that something existed just outside my understanding. Something structured, something already in motion. And every time I came close to asking, the moment passed, replaced by reassurance, or silence, or my own hesitation. I told myself it was temporary. That clarity would come when it needed to. That if there was something important, I would be included. I held on to that belief carefully, even as it began quietly to feel less certain. The first time something felt undeniably wrong, it was not because of what I heard. It was because of what I was not supposed to hear. I had gone in for a routine appointment alone. He said he had work. His mother said she would come, but did not. Neither explanation felt unusual. I had been to appointments before. I knew the process. The waiting area was quiet, controlled. Soft voices, occasional movement, the sound of pages turning. I sat with my hands folded over my stomach, focusing on the steady rhythm of my breathing. When my name was called, the nurse hesitated. Not long, just a second too long. She looked at her screen, then at me, then back again. "You're here alone today?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She nodded, but there was something in the way she did it, something careful, almost corrective. "Please come in," she said. The examination itself was routine. Measurements, standard questions, notes being entered into a system I could not see. I answered everything calmly, the way I always did. But when she stepped out briefly, she left the screen turned slightly toward me. I did not mean to look, but I did. There was a section open, details, structured fields, names. Most of it was familiar. My name, my information, and then below it another name. Not as a contact, not as an emergency reference. The placement was different, aligned with something official. I did not have enough time to understand it fully. The nurse returned and the screen shifted. The moment closed. I did not mention it. Not then. Not when I left. Not even when I got home. I told myself there could be an explanation, a clerical error, a system issue, something temporary. But the image stayed with me. Clearer than it should have been. That evening, when he asked how the appointment went, I answered the same way I always did. "Everything is normal," he nodded. "Good," he said. "That's what matters." I watched him for a moment longer than usual, waiting without knowing what I was waiting for. He did not add anything. The silence settled. A few days later, I overheard something again. This time, it was not fragmented. It was complete. He was speaking on the phone in the study. The door was slightly open, the same way it had been before. I was not trying to listen. I had only walked past. "The paperwork is already in progress," he said, his tone steady. "We just need to make sure everything aligns before the due date." A pause. Then, "No, she doesn't need to be involved in that part." The words did not feel ambiguous. They did not feel like something I had misunderstood. They felt clear, deliberate. I stopped walking. Not long. Just enough to confirm that I had heard correctly. Then I kept moving, because standing there would have required a response, and I did not have one ready. That night I could not sleep, not because I was afraid, but because my thoughts no longer arranged themselves neatly. They overlapped, repeated, returned to the same points. The name on the screen, the tone in his voice, the word involved. I began to notice other things, small corrections in conversation. When someone referred to the baby as yours, he would sometimes adjust it. Everything is being taken care of, he would say instead. Not wrong, just redirected. His mother's questions became more precise. Have you considered recovery support? She asked one afternoon. I'll be here, I said. She smiled slightly. Yes, she said, of course. But her expression suggested that was not what she meant. Later, I went back to the study, not to search, just to stand in the space, to see if anything felt different. The folder I had seen before was no longer on the desk. In its place were other papers arranged neatly, intentionally. Too intentionally. I opened a drawer. Inside were more documents, organized, labeled. None of them with my handwriting. I did not go through them, not fully, but I recognized enough. Legal formatting, structured language, sections that did not belong to medical records. I closed the drawer carefully, exactly the way I had found it. That was the moment the doubt shifted. It stopped being something I dismissed and became something I observed, quietly, deliberately. I did not ask him about the phone call. I did not mention the screen. I did not bring up the documents, not because I was ignoring it, but because I understood something I had not understood before. Whatever was happening, it was already organized, already discussed, already moving forward, and I was the only one not included. The realization did not feel sudden. It felt confirmed, like something that had been forming in the background, now stepping into focus. I sat in the living room that evening the same way I always did, hands resting over my stomach, breathing steady. He sat beside me reviewing papers, calm as ever. Nothing about him suggested urgency. Nothing suggested concealment, only consistency. The same word he had used before, the same structure, the same quiet control. I watched him for a long time. Not searching for emotion, not expecting explanation, just observing. Because for the first time, I was no longer trying to understand what I was being told. I was trying to understand what was being done. And that difference changed everything. I chose a quiet moment to ask, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I needed to hear how it would be given. It was late evening. The house was still. His mother had already left, and the usual movement of the day had settled into something predictable. He was in the living room, reviewing a set of papers the same way he did most nights. I sat across from him for a while before speaking. I saw something at the clinic, I said. He did not look up immediately. What do you mean? He asked, his tone neutral. There was another name in my file, I said carefully. It wasn't listed like a contact, it looked official. Now he looked at me. Not surprised, just attentive. There are often administrative overlaps, he said. Systems are not always updated correctly. I also heard you on the phone, I continued before I could reconsider. You said there was paperwork that I didn't need to be involved. A pause, not long enough to be silence, just long enough to measure the space between words. You've been under a lot of stress, he said finally. It's normal for things to feel more significant than they are. I don't think I misunderstood, I said. I'm not saying you did, he replied calmly. I'm saying context matters. You're connecting things that aren't related. His voice remained even, controlled. There was no defensiveness, no visible discomfort, only explanation. You don't need to worry about paperwork, he added. It's routine. I'm handling it so you don't have to. I held his gaze, trying to find something that did not align. Something that would confirm what I had already started to understand. There was nothing obvious, only consistency. And the name? I asked. I'll check with the clinic, he said. If there's an error, they'll correct it. He returned his attention to the papers in front of him. The conversation from his perspective was complete, but something had shifted, not in what he said, in how it was said, every answer redirected, every concern reframed, not dismissed outright, just absorbed and neutralized. The next day, his mother arrived earlier than usual. She moved through the house with the same quiet authority, setting things in place, adjusting details that did not seem to require adjustment. "I heard you were asking questions," she said at one point, standing near the doorway. Her tone was not accusatory, just informed. "I was trying to understand something," I replied. She nodded slowly. "Understanding comes with time," she said. "Right now, your priority should be stability." "I am stable," I said. She gave a small, measured smile. "Of course," she said, "but stress can present itself in subtle ways." The words were careful, not direct enough to challenge, not vague enough to ignore. "I'm not confused," I said, more quietly than I intended. "No one is saying you are," she replied. "We're just making sure you don't become overwhelmed." We, again, the same quiet inclusion that did not include me. Later that afternoon, I noticed something else. One of the documents on the table had been repositioned. It was a small change, but enough that I knew it had been moved. I picked it up. It was a medical summary. At least that's what it appeared to be, but there were sections I did not recognize, additional notes, references to consultations I had not attended. Before I could read further, he entered the room. "You shouldn't go through these without context," he said, taking the paper from my hand. "I'm trying to get context," I replied. "And I'm giving it to you," he said, still calm. "You just need to trust that everything is being handled appropriately." The word trust lingered longer than the others, not because it was unfamiliar, because it was being used differently, as a response, not a foundation. That evening, he suggested I rest earlier than usual. "You've seemed tired," he said. "It's better if you don't overthink things." I went to the bedroom without arguing, not because I agreed, but because I needed space. Away from the structure of his voice, away from the careful pacing of every explanation. I sat on the edge of the bed the same way I did every morning. Only this time the room did not feel unfamiliar. It felt clarified, not in detail, in pattern. Every time I asked a question, the answer removed the need for further questions. Every time I noticed something, it was redefined as something else. Every inconsistency was given a reasonable explanation. And every explanation required me to accept that I was misinterpreting something. Not lied to, just mistaken. That distinction mattered, because it meant there was no clear point of resistance. No moment where I could say, "This is false." Only a continuous suggestion that my understanding was incomplete. I lay down slowly, one hand resting over my stomach. The movement inside me was steady, unaware of language, unaffected by tone. That part remained unchanged. But everything around it felt increasingly structured. Not chaotic, not emotional, deliberate. And I understood something then that I had been avoiding. This was not confusion. It was control. Not loud, not forceful, but precise. And the more I tried to approach it directly, the more it redirected me back into silence. So I stopped asking. Not because I was satisfied, but because I needed to see what would happen if I said nothing at all. The first piece of proof did not come from a conversation. It came through the mail. It was delivered in the late afternoon, placed among the usual envelopes, bills, notices, things that followed predictable patterns. I would normally leave them untouched until he sorted through them in the evening. That day, I did not. There was one envelope that stood out, not because of its size or marking, but because it was addressed in a way that felt formal. My name was written in full. No abbreviations. No familiarity. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper inside. The document was structured, legal in tone, Not something I had seen before in our home, but not entirely unfamiliar either. Certain words repeated: guardianship, designation, primary consideration. I read each line more than once, not because I did not understand the words, because I did not understand how they were connected to me, or more specifically, how they were connected to my child. There was a section that referenced an ongoing process, not completed, but in progress. And within that section, there was a name, the same name I had seen at the clinic. This time, it was not a brief glimpse on a screen. It was written clearly, intentionally, aligned with legal language. I did not react immediately. I folded the paper back along its original crease, placed it inside the envelope, and returned it to the table exactly where I had found it. By the time he came home, everything appeared unchanged. I watched him as he went through the mail. He paused at that envelope just for a moment, then continued sorting. He did not mention it, not then, not later. That silence confirmed more than the document itself. A few days after that, I had another appointment. This time, I paid closer attention, not to the procedures, to the people. The receptionist recognized me when I approached the desk. Her expression shifted slightly, subtle but noticeable. "Your file has already been updated," she said before I had said anything. "Updated?" I asked. She hesitated, then adjusted her tone. "Just routine processing," she clarified. "Everything is in order." "I didn't request any updates," I said. She looked at the screen again, then back at me. There was a moment where she seemed to consider something. "You might want to speak directly with your consultant," she said carefully. "They would have more detailed information." It was not a direct answer, but it was not dismissal either. It was a redirection, one that suggested there was something to find if I asked the right person. I nodded. "Thank you," I said. Inside the consultation room, the doctor was professional, composed, the same as always. But even here, something had shifted. There were pauses where there had not been pauses before, moments where she reviewed the screen longer than necessary. "Is everything all right?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "From a medical perspective, everything is progressing normally." From a medical perspective, the distinction was new. "Is there anything else I should be aware of?" I asked. She looked at me directly then, not in the usual clinical way, more deliberately. "I would recommend that you review all documentation related to your case," she said, "and ensure that everything reflects your understanding." "My understanding of what?" I asked. She did not answer immediately. "Of your situation," she said finally. The phrasing was careful, but it carried weight. I did not push further, not there, not in that room. When I returned home, the house was quiet. I went directly to the study. This time I did not hesitate. The drawer opened the same way. The documents were still organized, still precise. But now I knew what I was looking for. I found it quickly. A file that matched the structure of the document I had received. Inside, there were multiple pages, signed in places, initialed in others, dates that aligned with appointments I had attended and some that I had not. And there again the name, consistent, repeated, positioned in relation to my child in a way that did not include me, not fully, not securely. I read enough to understand the pattern, not enough to see the entire structure, but enough. There were references to long-term arrangements, to custodial considerations, to contingency planning. All written in language that avoided direct statements but implied outcomes. I closed the file carefully, returned it to its place, left the room exactly as I had found it. That evening, I did something I had not done before. I wrote things down, not emotionally, not as a reaction, as a record, dates, phrases, observations, the envelope. The receptionist's tone, the doctor's wording, the documents in the drawer, each detail placed in order, not to confront, not yet, but to preserve. Because I understood now, this was not something that would reveal itself through a single moment. It was something built across time, structured, layered, and supported by people who believed I would not question it, or if I did, that I would not be able to prove it. But the proof was already there, in systems, in records, in language that did not match what I had been told. I sat at the table long after I finished writing. The house remained quiet, unchanged. From the outside, everything still appeared stable, routine, controlled, but underneath that the truth had begun to surface, not loudly, not completely, but enough that it could no longer be dismissed. And for the first time, I did not feel uncertain. I felt aware. After that, the house did not change. That was the first thing I noticed. Nothing shifted in a way that could be pointed to. No arguments, no visible tension, no sudden absence of routine. The same meals were prepared. The same conversations took place. The same quiet structure held everything in place. But within that structure, access began to narrow. Not openly, not in a way that could be questioned, just gradually. The documents in the study were no longer left unattended. The drawer that had once been easy to open was now locked, not with anything obvious, just a small change in resistance, a subtle difference in how it responded when I tried to pull it. I did not force it. There was no reason to reveal that I had noticed. His phone habits became more deliberate. Calls were no longer taken within hearing range. If it rang while we were sitting together, he would silence it, then step away minutes later to return it. Once I watched him from across the room as he spoke. His tone was calm, measured, the same tone he used with me. "We're finalizing the sequence," he said. "Everything will be in place before the delivery." A pause. Then, "No, there won't be complications." "It's already structured." Structured. The words settled into place with everything else I had seen. When he returned, he did not mention the call. I did not ask. His mother's presence shifted as well. She began staying longer. Not overnight, but long enough that the house felt continuously occupied by her movements. She brought additional items, clothes for the baby, supplies I had not asked for, things that suggested preparation beyond what I had been told. One afternoon, I found her in the spare room, not arranging, organizing. There was a bag on the bed. Inside were items neatly folded, labeled in small tags. "What is this for?" I asked. She did not seem surprised to see me. "It's better to be prepared," she said. "For what?" I asked. "For transitions," she replied. The word did not match the context. "Transitions," I repeated. She nodded once. "There are always adjustments after birth," she said. "It's important that everything is smooth." Smooth like everything else. I looked at the bag again. There were duplicates of items I had already prepared, separate, independent, as if intended for a different space. I did not comment further. Later that evening, I noticed that some of my own things had been moved. Not removed, just repositioned, drawers reorganized, clothes shifted. Personal items placed in different locations. Subtle enough that someone else might not notice. But I did. When I mentioned it, his response was immediate. "We're just making things more efficient," he said. "You shouldn't have to worry about small details." "I didn't ask for anything to be changed," I said. "It's for your benefit," he replied. "You need to conserve your energy." Again, the same structure. Every action framed as care. Every decision presented as necessary. I stopped responding after that, not because I agreed, because I understood that agreement was not required, only compliance. A few days later, I returned to the clinic. This time, I requested to see the consultant directly. There was a delay before I was called in, longer than usual. When I entered, the room felt different, not physically, but in tone, more formal, more observed. The consultant reviewed my file in silence for several seconds before speaking. "There have been additional notations added to your case," she said. "I'm aware," I replied. She looked at me carefully. "Are you in agreement with all listed arrangements?" she asked. The question was direct. but the wording was precise. Arrangements, listed, agreement. I haven't been informed of them, I said. Another pause, then she nodded slowly. In that case, she said, I would strongly advise that you seek independent clarification before proceeding further. Further with what? I asked. She did not answer directly. Before the delivery, she said instead. When I left the room, I did not feel confused. I felt confirmed. Whatever had been structured was approaching a point where it would become active. Something that would no longer remain contained within documents and conversations. Something that would require acknowledgement. When I returned home, he was already there, sitting in the living room, waiting. You were at the clinic longer than expected, he said. I spoke with the consultant, I replied. And, he asked. She suggested I review all arrangements independently, I said. His expression did not change. That's standard, he said. They have to say that. I told her I wasn't informed, I added, a slight shift, not visible in movement but in attention. There's nothing to be concerned about, he said. Everything has been planned carefully. By who? I asked. We, he replied. The word landed differently now, not inclusive, defined. I held his gaze, waiting, not for explanation, for confirmation. It came in the form of silence. A silence that did not correct anything I had understood. That evening, I added more to my notes. Dates. Statements. Phrases that aligned with documents I had seen. I began organizing them not just as observations, but as a sequence. A timeline that moved toward a single point. The due date, everything referenced it. Everything was structured around it, not the pregnancy, not the child, the moment of arrival. That was where all the preparation led. That was where the arrangements would take form. I closed the notebook carefully, placed it where it would not be found, and sat in the quiet that followed. There was no urgency in my movements, no outward reaction, only a steady awareness that time was no longer neutral. It was being used, measured, directed, and I was expected to move through it without resistance, to arrive at that point unquestioning, unprepared, unaware, but that was no longer true. I did not know every detail. I did not have every document, but I had enough. Enough to understand that what was being built around me was not temporary. It was intended to last. And if I did nothing, it would. The clarity did not arrive as a single realization. It settled slowly until there was no space left to deny it. I stopped trying to interpret their words. I stopped searching for explanations that would make everything reasonable again, because nothing I had seen required interpretation anymore. It required acknowledgement, the documents, the language, the timing. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. The child I was carrying had already been placed into a structure that did not center me. Not fully, not securely. I was still present in it, but not protected by it. That distinction stayed with me. I did not confront him again, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I already had it. And asking again would only give him another opportunity to reshape it. Instead, I shifted. Not outwardly. Everything I did remained the same. I followed the same routines, responded the same way, maintained the same tone. But internally, I stopped participating in the version of reality they were offering me. I began working quietly within my own understanding. The notebook became more than a record. It became structure. I organized every detail I had into sequences, dates aligned with documents, statements aligned with actions. I wrote down exact phrases. Everything will be in place before the delivery. You don't need to be involved. It's already structured. Each sentence, placed in context, formed a pattern that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding. It showed intent, consistency, preparation. I also began to gather copies, not by taking anything directly, but by using what was already accessible to me, medical summaries that I requested personally, appointment records printed under the justification of personal review, Every document I obtained independently was compared to what I had seen in the house. The differences were small, but important. Additional notations, references that existed in one version and not the other. It confirmed what I had suspected. There were parallel records. One I was allowed to see, and one I was not. That realization changed how I moved. I became more precise, more deliberate. When his mother spoke, I listened without reacting. When he explained something, I let him finish without interruption. Not because I accepted it, but because I needed them to continue believing that I did. That belief was the only reason I still had access to anything at all. One afternoon, I returned to the clinic without informing him. I requested a full copy of my file, not summaries, everything. There was hesitation at first, procedural delays, requests for confirmation, but I remained calm, consistent. I did not explain why I needed it, only that I did. Eventually, they provided it, not immediately, but enough to begin. I spent hours reviewing it later, cross-referencing, marking sections that did not align. And there it was again, the name, not as a mistake, not as an isolated entry, but integrated into specific sections that implied involvement beyond anything I had agreed to. I did not react emotionally, not in the way I expected. There was no immediate anger, no visible distress, only a steady recognition of what had already been done, and what would happen next if I allowed it. That night, he asked me a simple question. "Are you feeling all right?" I looked at him for a moment, measuring the distance between what he was asking and what he already knew. "Yes," I said, because the answer in that moment was not about feeling. It was about position. I understood my position now, not as a participant, as an obstacle, something that needed to remain stable until it could be adjusted, managed, repositioned. The word his mother had used returned to me: transitions. I sat with that word for a long time, until its meaning settled into something clear. They were not preparing for a shared future. They were preparing for a transfer. The realization did not break me. It did something quieter. It removed hesitation. I stopped considering whether I should act, and started considering how. Not in a reactive way, not impulsively, but with the same structure they had used, carefully, documented, supported by systems, not emotion. I began organizing everything into a single timeline, one that could be understood without explanation, one that did not rely on what I said, but on what had already been written, recorded, signed, because I understood something now that I had not understood before. This was never going to be resolved through conversation, or confrontation, or emotion. It had been built through systems, and it would only be undone the same way. I closed the notebook that night and placed it beside me. My hand rested over my stomach, the same as always. The movement inside me was steady, unaware of any of this, untouched by intention. That part remained mine, not because anyone had given it to me, but because it had never been theirs to define. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel uncertain. I did not feel conflicted. I felt resolved, not to fight, not to argue, but to let everything they had built be seen, exactly as it was. The shift did not happen in the house. It happened outside of it, quietly, through places and people they did not control. I did not tell him what I was doing. I did not change my behavior in ways that could be noticed. Every routine remained intact, every response measured. But the records I had organized, I began placing them where they could no longer be contained. The first step was simple. I submitted a formal request for clarification through the clinic's administrative system. Not a complaint, not an accusation, a request. Attached to it were copies of documents I had obtained independently, along with notes indicating inconsistencies between what had been recorded and what I had consented to. The language was precise, neutral. There was no emotion in it, only fact, dates, names, Signatures. Within days, I received a response, not detailed, but different in tone. They acknowledged the request. They indicated that a review would be conducted. And they asked me to attend a follow-up meeting. I agreed. At the same time, I sought independent verification of the legal documents I had seen. Again, not confrontational. I provided copies, asked for interpretation, nothing more. The response came back structured, clear. Certain sections, I was told, implied intent that could not be enacted without my direct and informed consent. Other sections raised questions about how the documents had been initiated. The language used in that explanation did not accuse, but it did not validate what had been done either. It introduced something new: scrutiny. That was enough. The meeting at the clinic was scheduled for the following week. When I arrived, the environment felt different, more formal, less routine. There were additional people present, not many, but enough to change the dynamic. The consultant was there. So was a member of the administrative team. They reviewed the documents in front of me. Not quickly, carefully, page by page, they asked questions, not about my emotions, about my awareness. Were you informed of this designation? No. Did you provide consent for this addition? No. Were these terms explained to you at any point? No. Each answer was simple, uncomplicated, supported by the absence of any record indicating otherwise. They did not react visibly. They wrote things down, made notes, cross-referenced. At one point, the consultant paused. There are discrepancies here, she said. The word was clinical, but it carried weight. The administrative representative nodded. We will need to escalate this for further review, they said. Escalate. Another word that shifted things without raising volume. I left the meeting without confrontation, without resolution, but with something more important: acknowledgement, not from him, not from his family, from the system they had relied on. That acknowledgement did not stay contained. Requests for clarification began extending beyond me, to those who had submitted documents, to those whose names appeared in places they should not have. I did not see those interactions directly, but I saw the effects. That evening, when he returned home, something had changed, not in what he said, in what he did not. He did not ask about my day. He did not mention the clinic. He moved through the house with the same controlled rhythm, but there was a difference in pace. A slight delay in movements that had once been automatic. His phone rang once. He answered it immediately, no hesitation. I understand, he said. A pause, then we'll address it. When he ended the call, he did not look at me. He did not need to. The structure had been interrupted, not by confrontation, but by exposure. Over the next few days, his mother's visits stopped. No explanation, no message, just absence. The house felt larger without her presence, not emptier, just less managed. A few documents reappeared in places they had not been before, not the same ones, not complete, but enough to show that something was being reviewed, adjusted. The name that had appeared consistently was no longer visible in the same way, not removed, but repositioned, as if its placement had become uncertain. I continued documenting everything, not out of fear, but because the process was not finished. Consequences, I understood now, did not arrive as a single event. They unfolded, quietly, across systems, across timelines, in ways that did not require confrontation to be felt. One afternoon, I received a formal notice, a confirmation that all previously submitted designations related to my case had been suspended pending full review. Suspended. The word did not undo what had been attempted, but it stopped it, completely, without negotiation, without permission. That evening, he sat across from me in the living room, the same place we had sat every night. The same distance, the same silence, but this time there was nothing left for him to explain, and nothing left for me to ask. because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed where it could no longer be denied. Not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. The systems had seen it, the records had shown it, and that was enough. The house is still quiet, not in the same way it used to be. Before, the silence felt arranged, held in place by routines, by decisions I did not question. Now it feels unstructured. Nothing is being managed behind it. Nothing is being adjusted while I am not looking. His mother does not come anymore. There was no explanation, no final conversation, just a gradual absence that became permanent. He still lives here, but not in the same way. We move around each other carefully, without conflict, without discussion. The language between us has thinned. There are no more reassurances, no more explanations offered before I can ask, only necessary words and long spaces between them. The documents are no longer in the house, not the ones I saw before, not the ones I was not meant to understand. Everything now exists where it should have from the beginning, within systems that require clarity, not assumption. The notice I received remains unchanged, all prior arrangements suspended, under review, inactive. That word mattered more than anything else. Inactive. It did not erase what was attempted, but it ensured that nothing could move forward without me, and that was enough. I do not revisit what happened, not out of denial, but because everything that needed to be confirmed already has been, through records, through absence, through the way certain things no longer continue. At night, I sit the same way I always have, one hand resting over my stomach. The movement inside me is steady, unaffected. Unaware, that part was never part of their structure. It was never something they could define, only something they tried to place, and failed. There is no resolution that feels like victory, no moment where anything is returned, only a quiet understanding that what was built without me could not survive being seen with me still present.